Hi, everybody. I'm Ralph Benmergui. Welcome to Not That Kind of Rabbi. Every once in a while, I do clarify that indeed I'm not a rabbi, but I am an ordained spiritual director. I do spiritual counseling and workshops. As a matter of fact, I just finished a workshop on Sunday. I did an afternoon workshop with a lovely group of people about aging to saging and how we can turn around the idea of sort of getting older as some pathological issue and make it more of a spiritual journey into the autumn of life, the renewal of life, and new purpose, with a bit of a different fuel for the engine of what we do. So it was a lovely event, and I really enjoyed it. Been getting some lovely notes from people on the Facebook page, Not That Kind of Rabbi, about some of the interviews we've been doing, and really appreciate that. And there've even been people who've been donating to Not That Kind of Rabbi. And if you'd like to be one of those, go to the Facebook page and click on donate, and you are free to give as little or as much as you'd like to keep us going so that we can continue to give you this show. Uh, Robert Priest was on a little while ago, got a lot of reaction to that, very positive. Robert had you could have looked at it as a woeful tale to tell about depression, 14 months hospitalized recently for depression, but he's come out of it with a lot of beauty and strength and more poetry in him and writing. He told a great story, I have to say, about um, when he was in there. He agreed finally to do electroconvulsive therapy, which most people associate with only very bad things like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and that sort of thing. But it's a much different thing now, and it helped him. It was the only thing that helped him at that point. And so he was there also advocating that it not be banned, that it still be an option for people at the behest of one of his doctors who said, please tell people that this is a valid form of therapy. It's not a torture. They sedate people now. They don't have pain, but you do lose pieces of memory for a while, and they take a while to come back. And one of the things he lost was that he'd written a trilogy, an entire trilogy of fantasy books, and he had no idea what they were about. So he read one. And can you imagine that you've written a book, you can't remember anything about it, so you're reading basically somebody else's book. So he read the book, and about halfway through, he said to his wife, this is good. I like this. And when he got to the end, he went, what an ending. That was fantastic. So irony and beauty and all those things. He did have a poem. He talked about his father a lot, and his father was not kind to him when he was young, was quite distant and harsh, and at times physical. And there's been, a healing over the years, but I wanted to read you the poem because I think it's pretty powerful. My father's hands. My father had so many hands. He almost three. My father had so many hands. He had almost three. My father had almost three hands, but not enough to touch me once gently. Oh, my father had so many eyes. He had almost three. My father had so many eyes. He had almost three. My father had almost three eyes, but not enough to see me once perfectly. My father had but one mouth and one heart to lift those bales and bales at the factory. My poor father of fists and fists, beating at the wall, beating at his brow, beating at his children. My poor factory father, lined and fat-bellied now, tranquilized and happier, made smaller by so many suns. The winds gave him only one heart, and they said, here, spin it. Make it the hole in rock. We whistle shrill through. Grit your teeth and count your children. He wonders what to do with hands now, where to put them, these tender-lined things that ache for sons. Oh, my father, we are here, the prince of wanting, emblazoned on us like radioactive brands. My father had so many hands, and he waves them now, ashamed a little, looking puzzled as we leave, at the movement from his wrist, as if he wondered, what are they when they are not fists? That's My Father's Hands from Robert Priest, and I wanted to share that with you because I think it's a beautiful poem. Our relationship with our fathers as sons is complex and interesting. My father died over 30 years ago, so my relationship changed. Sometimes when I talk to friends of mine and their fathers or mothers or people very close to them have died, and it's the first time someone in their life has died of that importance, they tend to think it's over, that there's no relationship anymore. My experience is that's just not true. I'm not talking about images and visions and real dialogue of some kind. I'm just they're always going to be there. They're always a companion to your life. And sometimes they're your guardian angel, and sometimes they're the dark shadow in the corner of the room. But the relationship continues in one way or another. And one of the things I do in that aging workshop is a rabbi who I was learning from. Her name is Rev Nadia Gross out in Boulder, and she writes an "Oh my God" letter to everyone in her family that really matters to her. And I said, "Well, what's that about?" She said, "Well, I have 4 kids and a husband who's also a rabbi, Victor Gross, and." She said one day, someone's going to probably walk into a room and go, "I'm sorry that your mother died." And they're going to go, "Oh my God." So she wants them to be able to go somewhere online or in her filing cabinet and read a letter that she wrote, and she rewrites them every year to those children or to her husband or to her mother, whoever she wants. And in writing that letter, you realize the things you never say to the people you love in your life. And she said, what it does is, yes, there's that letter in case you didn't get to say goodbye. But on the other hand, it makes you realize that you shouldn't wait, that you should just talk to people about your life and what they've meant to you while you're alive and while they can hear you. And it changed the way she related to her children and her husband after that. So it's a lovely little exercise if you want to try it. I always find that halfway through the letter, I'm crying because I'm talking about things that I don't share enough. Dear son, and it's not an advice letter. Speaking as an annoying Jewish man, I'm trying to tell you it's not a good idea to go, what you should have done is finish the master's degree. That would have been a thing. But no, you had to go and Mr. Funny. All of a sudden, Mr. Funny is alive. So don't do that. Just tell them what you appreciate and how much you, in some ways, it's also a chance to say, I wish I could have done better, because we all wish we could have done better. But in other ways, it's a way of saying thank you for being someone who loved me back. It's a good thing. So that's a little thing of fathers, I guess, without having some corporate entity tell me it's Father's Day soon. I'm reaching out to you as fathers and as sons and as daughters and fathers. Michael Posner has been writing for a very long time. A lot of you probably know him from his writing in the Globe and Mail. He's written for just about every major magazine in Canada you could think of, and he's written books, of course. Now, he's done an interesting thing. He's taken a Canadian icon, Leonard Cohen, and instead of just writing a biography in his own words about these things with the occasional reference to somebody who knew him, he's done hundreds of interviews and created a collage, a trilogy of books. This is the first book, The Early Years, but a trilogy of this magnitude is filled with all of these people who saw Leonard Cohen, and from Leonard Cohen himself, how he saw himself at different phases of his life. So we're going to talk about the early years, and he's here to do that with me. Mr. Posner, hello, how are you?
Hi, Ralph. I'm well, thank you, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
No problem. So what made you decide that you needed to really explore in such great detail the life of Leonard Cohen?
Um, well, it goes back to an earlier book I had done on another Canadian icon, Mordecai Richler, and I had adopted the same technique, as it were, oral biography, I call it. Um, Mordecai had just passed, and so I started out on a little journey to collect stories about Mordecai, who, as you probably know, was a bit of a character, a little curmudgeonly, and and so I did that book, and then some years not long after that was published, it occurred to me that Leonard might be an appropriate candidate for similar kind of treatment. So I wrote to him, and he was in the middle of suing his former personal manager, who had absconded with a mere $5 million of his money, and so it was not a propitious time. He may not have done it in any event, but he wrote back and said, "Well, that's an interesting idea, but not now." And so I was at the Globe and Mail. I dropped the idea, but when he passed into 2016, I thought, maybe I can resurrect this idea. The Globe and Mail had seen fit to part company with me by that time. I was essentially unemployed. I was a freelance writer, and so I thought, let's see what I can find. I had read two biographies of Cohen, both of them quite good, I thought. One sort of had come out in 2012. That was Sylvie Simmons' book, I'm Your Man. Very good book, kind of emphasis on the music side. And earlier, Ira Nadel, who's a professor of literature at the University of British Columbia, leaning more to the literary side. But my instinct as a journalist was there's probably more to be had here, that they've given, a pretty exhaustive treatment of the well-known narrative line of Leonard Cohen's life. Let's see what else we can find. And so I began, and lo and behold, it turned out that there were quite a lot of stories that had never been told. So, a huge figure, much bigger internationally, obviously, than Mordecai, and so that appealed to me too, that the book might have some wider traction beyond Canada.
There's a whole aspect in here of Jewish Montreal. And over the years, I've interacted with lots of Jews from Montreal. And it's a different Jew than a Toronto Jew. At times, I kind of put it down to it being more kind of a Russian Jewish flavor, and the one in Toronto, the Ashkenazi Eastern European, was the Polish Jewish flavor, which is a more conservative and circumspect kind of Jew, which when I remember the first time I went to Montreal as a young man, and, I went to Ben's, the delicatessen, with the yellow walls and smoked meat and none of the charm or charisma of Schwartz's, which is more cafeteria. But even there, I could feel that there was this kind of siege mentality, this Anglo-Jewish, we got to stick together, Westmount kind of thing. So this is the kind of hatchery for Leonard Cohen, and you really paint that picture. Tell me what that Jewish firmament and what Lenny Cohen, how he fit into that.
Well, I think your observations are correct. I mean, I'm a Winnipegger by birth, which was also a kind of Russian Jewish enclave, and to some extent on a smaller scale, albeit not dissimilar from Montreal in the sense that we were, there was the Anglo-Protestant majority, there was a strong Ukrainian minority, and then the Jews were the sort of third tier down. And in Montreal, similarly, on a larger scale, you had the French majority, then the English minority, and then the Jewish minority within that. Almost three solitudes, in effect. He grew up in an affluent, prosperous, well-known, distinguished family with a wonderful pedigree, both intellectually and commercially. His mother's father was a learned Talmudic scholar. His grandfather had been head of the Jewish community, the chief rabbi of Montreal, or one of them. His other grandfather was a wonderful businessman, one of the most successful businessmen in Montreal at the time, founders of the Canadian Jewish Congress, the first Canadian Jewish newspaper, active on virtually, you could pick a charity and the Cohen family name was attached to it. Founders of Shara Shemaim Synagogue, three rows of in the front of the shul allocated or dedicated to the wider Cohen family, where the men wore top hats, kind of conservative bordering on Orthodox in terms of its orientation. And they would make a big deal of ritual vis-a-vis the high holidays or the other major holidays. So Leonard came of age in this milieu where Jews were a minority. They stuck together. Most of his childhood friends would have been Jewish. He went to Jewish summer camps. He took his bar mitzvah classes, of course, at Sher Shemaim, and was bar mitzvah there. But of course, the major event of his young life was the death of his father. It's interesting that you read the priest poem on that topic, but his father died when Leonard was 9, and so he's left with his mother, who's wonderful but somewhat neurotic and given to depression.
Let's talk about let's talk to his father for a second, though.
Sure. Because
I find it would appear an inevitability to this narrative that Lenny Cohen was growing up with a dad who saw himself as doomed.
Correct. Yes, there's a famous little anecdote where he turns to a relative in synagogue one day and tells the relative, he won't live to see Leonard's bar mitzvah, which he did not.
No.
Yes,
that has a profound effect on someone, right?
Profound effect. There's a story which Leonard told many times, perhaps apocryphal, I'm not sure, that on the day of the funeral or not long after, he writes his first poem. He's 9 years old, and he embeds that poem in a bow tie of his father's and buries it in the garden. Now, the father died when he was 9. It was January 1944. The snow in Montreal in January 1944 would have been pretty deep. So there's some question about the authenticity of the anecdote, but that was the story he told. And he, his remark in years later was, perhaps, and he went back to look for this poem years later and could never find it. And he said, perhaps that's all I've been doing all my life is looking for that first poem.
Yeah.
But the father was loving, but somewhat remote, somewhat didactic. He dressed formally. He kept his shoes neatly together beside his bed. His gun in a bedroom drawer. He had served in the military in World War I and been wounded, which contributed, of course, to his ill health.
That military piece was very influential on Cohen himself, right?
Absolutely influential. He said at some point that had his father lived, he probably would have been sent to Kingston and gone to military college. But you can see in Leonard's life the almost militaristic discipline that he adopts, both with respect to his clothing, with respect to his mannerisms, his rituals, and in his religious practice, both Judaic and Zen later on.
There's a wonderful moment that I think could be a whole movie, which is Cohen getting his hair cut by a barber who is really instilling in him a seed that would grow later into a full tree, which was Zen Buddhism.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know precisely what age. He would have been a young, perhaps just teenage years, and he's taken by an uncle first to introduce to this Japanese barber who talks to him about Zen for a while and until he gets down to business and actually cuts his hair. And as far as we know, that's his first introduction to the world of Zen.
But he went back there sometimes during off hours.
Yes, he did. Yeah, he did. So that is interesting. And then, of course, there's a line in The Favorite Game, his first novel published in 1963, where he talks about this sort of ideal of being a monk and having all kinds of women to sleep with. And that isn't far from what happened.
Yeah. I think he nailed that one.
He did nail that one, but it's, he wrote it in probably 1961 or 62, so it's extraordinary. Um,
What would you
um,
have made of spiritually looking at him and his growth as a child into his teen years? It seems to me that he identified without effort, profoundly as Jewish.
totally agree.
I
Totally
remember.
agree.
I remember once I interviewed him, and he'd done his time in L.A., near L.A., in a Buddhist monastery for years. I think it's 6 years or something. He was there, five or
He
six
was he
years,
was there for the better part of 5. Yeah.
5 years, right? And we were doing a radio interview together, and he was coming through town, and I loved talking to him because he had such a wry sense of humor, and people just saw him as a downer, but he had a twinkle, always a twinkle, it seemed. So we'd done TV interviews that were 5, 6, 7 minutes, and not that satisfying, but this was a good half hour. And I said to him, "Well, it looks like so you're a Buddhist now." And he looked at me and he just went, "No, no, no, I'm a Jew." I
Yes,
said, "But you just,"
absolutely.
I said, "But you just spent 5 months or 5 years at a monastery." And he goes, "Ralph, within anyone's religion is everything that you would like to look for. Your job is," and I never forgot this, is that your job was to build a fence around what's sacred in your life and try to make sure that people don't trample on the garden.
It's a great line. It's a great line. No, that's absolutely true. Um, he kind of abandoned Jewish ritual to some extent, except for Friday night candles and challah. Towards the end of his life, he did that quite regularly. I don't know that he ever went to. He did actually go to shul on Rosh Hashanah in later years as well. But there was a long stretch where he was not terribly observant of Jewish ritual. But in his soul, in his soul, he was very, very Jewish, and that never left him. And he always said many times, when people asked him about Zen, as you did, "I have a perfectly good religion. Why would I ever abandon
Yeah.
it?" So he was faithful to that. I don't know if you encountered it in the book, but he twice at the end of 1963, December 63, and again in June of 64, he gives 2 public addresses to the Jewish Public Library in Montreal. And he kind of enunciates a position that I think he basically adhered to for the rest of his life, which was essentially that, you can be a prophet or you can be a priest. And if you're a priest, you represent the community, you shepherd the community, you adopt and express the values of the community, you don't fight against the community much. And he identified A.M. Klein as being a kind of representative of that model. But his model was the prophet. I am one of you, but I am not going to accept necessarily your values or express them. The writer has to be at a distance from his community. And so he becomes a prophet, trying to point out the errors, the foibles, the omissions of the Jewish community. He didn't like the large synagogues, the appetite for materialism and consumerism. He
Yeah.
kind of turned away from that.
He his father dies, and he's left with a sibling and his mother. Um, it's interesting, his relationship with women. Like
It
you could
is.
you could look at it on the surface and just think, a ladies' man, as he was called, and I mean, you read the book and it never stops telling you about who he's sleeping with. It's just relentlessly sleeping with anyone in sight. It seems he just can't seem to stop, which doesn't speak to I'm not quite sure if that's about a profound insecurity, an inability to see a woman as anything unless he can see her as someone he can sleep with. Uh, and yet he's such a gentle soul, you
Very
know?
gentle soul, as every woman who met him would testify. And even the women he essentially abandoned in a sense, or who felt some regret at his parting, 90% of them speak well of him. You'll meet more of them in the future books. Um, there is a kind of, part of it is his adoration of beauty? I think it's a complicated question that you've posed. Part of it is the search, the suggestion perhaps that's made by a woman who's a Jungian who says that he never successfully separated from his mother and therefore could never attach himself to any other woman in his life. So that's the deep psychological rendering of that. Part of it is as some others have said or will say, that it was driven by his search for material. That in these sometimes intense, fraught relationships with women that often ended badly, there was material for his writing, and that all that ever mattered to him, or I shouldn't say that all that ever mattered, but the writing was more important than the relationship. And so I think it works on a number of levels, and my temptation or my conclusion is that we shouldn't try to reduce it or make it a reductive or binary choice about him.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing binary about him, frankly.
No.
He's
He contains multitudes.
like, even he's a camp counselor. And yet, I mean, I was a camp counselor at a Jewish camp. He was a camp counselor. I wasn't him. He had a soft voice. Everyone spoke about his magnetism and charm. And yet he had a sense of authority about him that had loudmouth kids listening to him. And then they'd find him, as he got older as a counselor, in a tent with one of the girls. And it would be nothing to it. It would be very quietly done, and see you later, and thank you very much.
Discreet.
Very discreet. So, that, and then he had the other part of him, that kind of militaristic sense of order, even to the point where later in his life, he dresses in khakis.
And
right?
And wears a Che Guevara beret for a while. But that magnetism, you see it again and again in his life. There was something about Cohen that I envy, which was his ability to be very still, very focused. There's a story a guy told me, an American writer, Dan Klein, who knew him on the Greek island of Hydra, and they go into Athens one day, take the boat to Athens. And they're sitting in this cafe. They're both young, they're guys in their 30s, handsome Jewish men. And Dan, Dan's a good-looking guy, and they're sitting in this cafe. Nobody knows who Leonard Cohen is. It's about 1968. And he says, all the women are just making a beeline for Leonard. I said, I might not as well have been there. And he said, I don't know what it was, but they just were drawn to him. You see it on the Isle of Wight concert in 1970, August 1970, where there's a rowdy crowd estimated at 600,000. It's 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning. They're drunk and disorderly, and they're lighting little bonfires and throwing beer bottles at the stage and at other performers. And Cohen comes on at 4 a.m., heavily drugged on Mandrax, and he manages to talk the crowd down. He just is completely charismatic. He does it again in Germany a few years later, where he comes on stage and has the temerity to issue the Hitler salute to the crowd in Hamburg. And they go wild with anger, because at that time, 1970, 1972, anything Hitler-esque was deeply offensive. But again, he manages to calm the crowd, and so there is that kind of that stillness at the core of him that I think people responded to.
What a thing to do for a Jew in Germany. I mean, I was in Germany once on a speaking thing, Canadian club at the two Canadian armed Air Force bases. Did you do that?
I did that.
Yeah, Baden and Lahr, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So the only reason I went is because Al Waxman had to cancel. So they said, okay, you go. So I went with my wife, and we had a great time.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, I'm sitting in the baths in Baden with these old German men. And I'm Moroccan. I don't have the Holocaust part of me in it. Like, it's not the same as it would be for you as an Ashkenazi Jew.
Right.
With direct connection to the slaughter.
Yeah.
I'm from the other side. So, but yet I'd grown up with it. It's part of my DNA. It's a generational trauma you pass on, and an important lesson you pass on. But I'm sitting in these baths looking at these guys and thinking, but you must have been in some way in that war. And I would have been someone who was subhuman to you, and you would have had murdered unless you could work me to death, which whatever came first. And I just found myself so confused because I thought I just want to jump up in this bath and either yell, you missed me, you know something like that, right? Just to go, fuck you, right?
But
And
I
that's
think
what
that's
I
what
did.
Leonard was doing. I
Yes,
think
that's the
that's
chutzpah.
exactly, yeah.
I mean, could
Some
you
people,
imagine doing that, standing on a stage and going, and that's unbelievable. And
well,
yet he comes across so soft, and so his edges have all been rounded, but the passion is direct.
and authentic, absolutely authentic. But remember, he also bought a Volkswagen in
Yeah.
1954.
Yeah, but then he got his friend who was disgusted by it, who then got his own Volkswagen edition.
Exactly. Yeah. Lionel Tiger. Yeah.
Yeah. When I think about him, there's all this stillness, even where he can stand at a window and a woman walks in, there's a friend, and just walks over to where he's looking out the window, and just they don't say anything for 5 or 10 minutes, which
Right.
nobody does. You feel impelled to talk, but it just drew her into his stillness, and that's fantastic. But I also see someone who seems to me to be insecure and yearning and searching and digging at holes and making a mess and moving on.
Yeah, I think that's true. The moving on for sure, because he just couldn't stay in the same place for very long. It became very uncomfortable for him psychologically, and he would move on. Since the book has been published and there's been a little bit of press attention, a number of people have come out of the woodwork that I didn't know existed, and I'm sure there's many others, just people that I never found in the course of my research. And there was a woman talked to the other day who was at camp with him in 1956. She was a counselor, co-counselor, and she became a psychologist, and they never had a relationship, but they were friendly. And she said, I asked her, did you ever see Leonard go to a dark place, become a bit depressed? So she said, oh, yes. Oh, yes. So he's now 56. He's 22, 21 years old. And she said, it was like sinking into black tar to be in his company when he was like that. It just overcame him. It was, I don't know if it was genetic or what it was, but it would overwhelm him. There's a story that's in a later book, which will give you, there's a couple phenomenal stories about him. There's one where he locks himself in a bathroom for 8 hours and won't come out. He's so depressed. There's a friend of his is in LA in the early 90s, comes over to visit and finds him curled up like a fetus on his balcony, unshaven, unwashed, unfed, completely catatonic. And she takes him home and bathes him and feeds him and essentially nurses him back to some semblance of life. So this was a very, he was often asked about it in interviews. He talked about it quite frankly, talked about all the things he did to treat it, from sex to drugs to alcohol to Zen to whatever. But it was basically something he couldn't overcome.
It's incredible. I've been speaking to more people lately who have a story of that dark horse, that depression that
The
is
black
always,
dog.
yeah, it's always stalking you. And so you're seeing that as the sort of anti-muse, the part that debilitates, as opposed to the other muse, which he finds in women and in drugs and in.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, I would say. That's a good way of putting it. And he would say nothing works. Nothing really works. Later in 1990, early 1999, he goes to India, and he spent by that time 25 years studying with this Japanese Zen master, Sasaki Roshi, and becoming a monk. and he becomes his, what's known in Zen as his inja. He becomes his aide. He cooks for him and he cleans for him. He's attached to him. He travels with him. It's like his private secretary. And he almost becomes a slave. He's so committed to this task, this service, that and he begins to recognize that there's something wrong, that he's kind of surrendered his own identity here. And so he becomes interested in Hinduism. And so he goes to India and studies with a Hindu master named Ramesh Balsekar. And he goes in 1999, he's planning to go for a few weeks, and he spends 4 months there. And he goes back the following year, and he goes back the following year. So and when he comes back to LA in 2001, 2002, he says for the first time, now I'm not totally convinced it was true, but he does say it, that the depression that had plagued him all his life had suddenly lifted. And indeed, in the later years of his life, there is a lot less evidence of darkness.
So that's part of the search. The search.
Absolutely.
I should tell people I'm talking with Michael Posner, who's authored released the first in a trilogy of books on Leonard Cohen, Untold Stories, the Early Years. And this is Not That Kind of Rabbi. I'm Ralph Ben-Mergi. What affected it? You really immersed yourself in Leonard Cohen here. I mean, you went to the publisher and it was like, I kind of got a lot here. They're like, you can't do this in one book. Okay. Maybe you want 3. How is Leonard Cohen intertwined with you now?
Well, I've made myself offensive to a whole group of family and friends because of my propensity for telling Leonard Cohen stories.
It's like, we heard it already, enough.
Exactly. So that becomes a bit tiresome. Listen, it occupied my life it has occupied my life for 4 years, coming up next month or 2 months, basically since he passed. And it was, it was exhausting and exhilarating at the same time. It becomes a bit of a detective hunt at sometimes, because you'll interview Ralph Ben-Mergi and he'll say, "Oh, did you talk to so-and-so? He's got a good Cohen story."
Yeah.
And that so-and-so will tell you 2 other people.
And then you kind of wish they didn't.
Well, at some
but then
point,
then you don't want to lose something. Yeah.
You don't want to lose something. You never know. And sometimes they have nothing. And then sometimes they surprise you and they have the most amazing insights and stories about him.
But it's interesting, he's not polarizing. He's not the kind of person that, in reading all these quotes, I'm not getting 8 different versions of, that's not the Leonard Cohen I knew. There's kind of a continuity to all this.
There is. There's a huge degree, there's a huge consensus about him. There are some naysayers, but they're very few. There are people that he chemically didn't work with, and they're critical. There's a couple of business relationships that go off the rails because Leonard would be enthusiastic one moment and then lose interest, and so the project would die, and
right.
the partner would be offended. Doesn't happen often, but it does happen. So there are some critics of him. There will be some women who saw him as essentially a serial seducer, not anywhere in the category of Harvey Weinstein, not even remotely in that category, because he was so charming. But nevertheless, and he was honest about it. I mean, one of his early songs, you probably know this, is the Stranger song. And the line in the Stranger song is, "I told you when I came, I was a stranger." And so he announces his objective pretty early on. I won't be here. I won't be here long.
His mother remained an interesting figure to me, but she also was somebody who just, didn't think what he was doing was a good idea. Why don't you just go and finish your degree and never finish anything? And she was a very ballsy woman who offended lots of people. And what would you say is the relationship, and how did it affect what we see as Leonard Cohen?
I think Aviva Leighton or somebody in the book calls it a love-hate relationship. I think he was deeply attached to her. I think there was a lot of love there. I don't want to diminish that aspect of it. At the same time, there are stories of, people being in his presence when his mother would call him on the phone and he'd be on the phone. Yes, mother. Yes, mother. Yes, mother, rolling his eyes. And she was a hovering mother, overprotective. He in his adolescence, he was not the Leonard Cohen we knew in later life, the always thin, very controlled about his weight. He was a very chubby Jewish boy in his early teens, or late teens actually, and she would feed him, he. It's a complicated relationship that
And
way.
she was, considering the status of the Cohen family. And for those who don't know, if your name is Cohen, should be Kohanim. You're a priest or a rabbi. So it's high status. Plus, they had the financial status. But his father married a woman who the others would see as peasant class.
Without knowing anything about her distinguished intellectual roots, they would have seen her as peasant class because she was Lithuanian. She spoke with the Russian accent or the Lithuanian accent. She was not as sophisticated.
Yeah.
But she also gave him an early love of music. Apparently she sang very well, and she loved Russian music, and she sang Russian music in the house frequently, and would have encouraged him. So I think on the one hand, she would have, probably said, finish your degree, become a lawyer or a doctor. Um, uh, but part of her also would have been very proud of what he did ultimately.
Right.
Ultimately. I think
Ultimately.
ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Marianne and Suzanne, they're in the
So,
book.
so Marianne, of course, is the Norwegian muse that he meets in 1960 on the island of Idra. She's recently separated from her husband. She has a 1-year-old baby, or a less than 1-year-old baby, and they're soon, living together and beginning what amounts to a kind of on again, off again romance that spans most of the 1960s. Um, there was infidelity on both parts, and the magic that they managed to create on Idra they were not able to translate beyond Idra because a couple times she came to Montreal and it just didn't work well. Part of it was his philandering, part of it was her philandering when he wasn't around. Um, but she did give him a lot. She certainly encouraged his writing on Idra. She functioned as a kind of muse for him. That was an authentic relationship, but it did have its strains. Suzanne Elrod comes into his life in 1969 in New York City at a Scientology convention, where he is briefly another one of his searches, in a sense, for meaning. He's immediately drawn to her physical beauty, and she becomes the mother of his 2 children in the early 1970s. And that relationship is really tempestuous and complicated. There's more of that in the second book. You just briefly meet her in this book,
Yeah,
which ends
yeah.
in 1970. Really interesting woman, 15 years younger than Leonard. It's a very complicated relationship. She called it a spider's web.
It's so interesting that he can't seem to, I don't know, he needs to always be able to know that he's separate from what is around him.
He needs never to feel trapped.
Well, so one person would say you're being trapped, another person would say you're deeply committing yourself to something, and that the only way to get real value from life is to commit.
He was deeply committed to non-committal.
But that's what I keep wondering about. He's like when I read that he was looking into Scientology, and I just thought he's just a seeker, a searcher, but there's a lost quality to it too. It's not just grounded seeking. He's seeking in women. He's seeking in religion. He's seeking in poetry. He's seeking in fame, right?
You nailed it. You nailed it. That's precisely it. Um, and you might say he's looking for himself, the essence of himself, which maybe was in part eroded or destroyed by the death of his father at the age of 9. It's a psychological conundrum. I mean, there are some suggestions that he dabbled in. Well, we know he took LSD, but he might have been part of those MK Ultra experiments at the Allen Institute in Montreal in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And yes, absolutely, always seeking. I mean, he was hungry for experience. We haven't mentioned Irving Layton's influence on him.
Yeah.
Irving was a major influence on him, and Irving believed in, seizing life by the throat and taking every experience and chewing it up. And Leonard learned something about that from him. I think that philosophy, he related to that philosophy.
It seemed like it was, they couldn't be more different in the way they were approaching what they were doing. Irving and his wife Aviva were just, that would have been a Grand Prix race through the streets of life. It was just so intense and so extroverted in its way. And then there's, Leonard, who's introverted, and yet he just keeps going back to the fuel and fire of Irving Layton. It's interesting.
That's a valid observation. Absolutely. He had a lot of time for Irving. Yeah.
But there was also competition too at a certain
There was
point.
a kind of unspoken competition. I mean, remember that Irving is, I don't know how many years older, but 20 years easily older than Leonard. And he's on the downward trajectory of his life in the same years that Leonard is on the upward trajectory. There's some envy a little bit on Irving's part. There's even some suggestion that Irving wanted to sing and do what Leonard did musically, but didn't have remotely that ability or talent. So there is some envy there, and I think there's a recognition on Leonard's part that he is in the ascendant. That if you were going to drape the mantle of poet laureate of Jewish Montreal on anybody after Layton, it would have been Leonard. But almost by the time it would have happened, he said, "I don't really want this," essentially.
Right.
And so he moved on. But they remained very, very close to the end of Irving's life. Leonard would visit him in the home where unfortunately Layton was suffering from dementia. Made regular visits whenever he was in Montreal. That was a long, deep relationship. But again, it had its strains. And there's other characters like that in the book as well. Friendships that where they would compete. They would compete for women. I think with other friends. That it was a competitive sport.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this idea of, a man who talks like this and very low, and yet there's a hurricane in this guy. He's just flying all over the place, looking for a landing spot. Coming onto shore. He just had so many contradictions. And I remember I interviewed him once on television for a variety show, and he was doing his big tour with the
1989.
Yeah, in the business. We were doing it in 91. He was on tour.
Oh, okay.
Because the business manager at the same time was also bleeding him dry, so it wasn't fun. But he's on this with me, and I said, what's the line from Hallelujah? I said, so, a line that's always struck me from this is, love is not a victory march, it's just a cold and broken hallelujah. And he looks at me, and there's a live audience, right? And he just goes, wow, you're bumming me out.
You're what? I missed that. You're what?
You're bumming me out.
Bumming me.
And I stopped and I realized, I went, wow, I just bummed out Leonard Cohen. Because To a lot of people, he was the most depressing singer you'll ever meet, right?
Yeah, he has that reputation. There's all these little code words they use about him. The bard of the bedsits, the grocer of despair.
Yeah, yeah,
All these descriptions. And other people will tell you that he was the funniest guy they ever
yeah,
met.
yeah.
And so, I mean, some of the songs definitely are dark. There's no question. You look at a song like "Dress Rehearsal Rag," which is about his temptation to commit suicide, and you kind of wonder where was he at when he wrote that song.
Do you listen to "You Want It Darker" at all, to the
I
album?
have many times. I think it's a
Powerful.
phenomenal last work. Do you know the album his son Adam produced posthumously after Leonard's death? I mean,
I
um,
saw some video of the concert he did, but I didn't get the
uh-huh. So
album.
there's so he got his father late in his life to, they're not sung so much as recited, recite some of his lyrics that were meant to be songs one day if he had survived.
Huh.
And then he took those songs and wrote music for them and embellished them with music from other people. And he turned out an album that could have been produced by Leonard. It's a magnificent work, actually.
Oh, I got to listen
Uh,
to that.
yeah, it's terrific.
Yeah. So, what do you want people to be? You have more books to put out, but when I say Leonard Cohen, you want me to think about what?
I want you to think about a guy who was deeply complicated human being who lived a very compartmentalized life that bounced around the world and bounced between the universe of music and the universe of literature, the universe of Zen and the universe of Judaism, and the universe of women. Um, he was he was a meticulous craftsman. He spent months, years, many times rewriting and rewriting the same lyric, changing a word or a comma until he got as close to perfection as he felt he could get. Um, and the work mattered deeply to him. I think part of him wanted to be that the prophet that he talked about in his speeches, his lectures in 1964. He wanted to be able to speak beyond this generation, as Bob Dylan has done so eloquently. Um, I think he kept that uh, that notion, that idea in mind, and his work through the years gets stripped down and stripped down, sparer and more spare. You look at the lyrics to the songs that appear on the last album, "You Want It Darker," and they could have been written by Samuel Beckett. They are monosyllabic. If there's a double syllable word or a triple syllable word, it's very rare. He's stripping everything to its essence. Um, and as one of his band members said to me after touring with him in the 1970s, he said, with Leonard, it was, how few notes can you play? How let's you don't have to play the notes to actually have an impact. And these musicians, some of whom went to Juilliard, or and were classically trained and were used to embellishments and riffs and long solos, and they would walk away from this experience profoundly changed as musicians by their exposure to Cohen. He had that magnetic effect on them as well.
Fantastic. The name of the book, Leonard Cohen, Untold Stories, The Early Years. Michael Posner is the curator of this biography of Cohen, I guess is the best way to say it.
Yep.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And
So do I.
I've got a great picture of me and Leonard at a show we did together, TV show we did together, with both of us with our right hand in our pockets, staring, and just being around him was so quietly powerful that it was just a real joy. So this brought back some really nice stuff. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. All the best. Okay.
You too.
Adios.
Adios. Michael Posner on Not That Kind of Rabbi. I'm Ralph Ben-Mergy. If you want, you can, you can join me in different ways. You can go to the Facebook page, Not That Kind of Rabbi. We have a donation button there if you want to do that. But also, you can throw in some comments about the shows you've been listening to. I just had somebody get in touch with me and say, I started listening, when you first started, and now I came back and realized now there's so many more people that I can listen to on your show. So feel free to plunge the depths of the bank that we're creating and to come up with any suggestions of anything you'd like. One more plug for the Jewish Men's Retreat for any Jewish men out there who might be interested. Go to menschwerk.org. And usually we do this in the United States, in Connecticut, once a year. I'm part of a wisdom council that has this JMR, Jewish Men's Retreat. So this is JMR 29, and obviously we're not going to Connecticut. It's virtual, which allows all kinds of people from anywhere to, on a Friday night and a Saturday during the day, we're going to come together. And it's really in the Jewish renewal movement, a wonderful experience for men. So if you're interested in that, just go to menschwerk.org and you'll see JMR 29 and you can register for it there. In the meantime, take care of each other. I'm Ralph Ben-Mergy, and I'll see you soon on Not That Kind of Rabbi.
This podcast has been produced by TMDS and accelerated by Roam Phone. Roam Phone brings you the most reliable virtual phone service to run your business and protect your home number from unwanted calls. Visit roamphone.ca to get started.